There is a number buried in a Royal Navy record from 1813 that almost nobody talks about, and it says more about what the sea did to men than any battle account ever written. By that year, the Navy's own physicians had calculated that sailors went mad at 7 times the rate of ordinary people living on shore. 7 times. On a ship that was supposed to be a working machine crewed by professionals who had chosen the sea, that the Admiralty eventually built its own asylum in London just to absorb the overflow. The popular image of the sailor, and especially of the pirate, is a man undone by violence, by cannon shot, by scurvy eating through his gums, by the rack of a hurricane. That picture is not wrong exactly, but it leaves out the thing that experienced seamen feared more consistently than any storm. They feared the calm, a flat, windless, glassy-surfaced sea sitting under an equatorial sun, with nothing moving and the sails hanging as limp and useless as wet rags and the ship going absolutely nowhere, not backwards, not into danger. Just nowhere for days that turned into weeks, because there is nothing cinematic about a group of men slowly losing their minds in perfect, total, airless silence. This video is about what that silence actually did to them. It is about the physics of a specific belt of ocean near the equator, the documented stages of psychological collapse that followed when a crew was trapped inside it, the mutinies it seeded, the legends it produced, and the cost that the history books tended to leave below decks. The record is more human, and considerably darker than the myth allows. If you want history that actually holds up, subscribe. I put one of these out every week. Now, to understand what the stillness was, you first have to understand where it lived. The place had a name before it had a proper explanation. The articles that every man signed spelled out his share of any prize and his rights aboard the vessel. It was a functioning system, and it functioned because it was pointed at an objective. When the wind died, the objective evaporated, and what was left was a group of armed, fractious, sun-scorched men with nothing to do and no good reason to defer to anyone. The watches became hollow rituals because there was nothing to adjust and nowhere to steer. The horizon contained no prizes because no one was moving toward the horizon. The carpenter could only inspect so many times before the inspection became a performance, and everyone knew it. Edward Barlow, the merchant sailor who kept a journal across 40 years at sea in the late 17th century, one of the most detailed records of ordinary maritime life that survives, described this idleness as its own form of torment distinct from hunger or thirst, a grinding purposelessness that wore at a man differently than physical suffering did because it left him entirely alone with his own thoughts, and the heat and the flat, mirrored surface of the water going in every direction with no variation and no end. On a Navy ship, the response to this kind of idleness was enforced busywork and the threat of the lash. Decks were scrubbed that did not need scrubbing. Rope was coiled and recoiled. Officers invented tasks because the alternative was watching discipline dissolve in the heat. On a pirate ship, that option was not available in the same way, because the articles that gave the crew their democratic rights also constrained the captain's ability to impose arbitrary punishment. The quartermaster could adjudicate disputes and order reasonable discipline, but he could not simply flog a man for sitting in the shade and staring at the water, because there was genuinely nothing else to do. The resentments that a working voyage kept submerged under fatigue and purpose now had hours, then days, to surface and find each other across the cramped deck. Small grievances became significant ones. Old arguments that had been too exhausted to sustain during a hard passage now had all the time in the world. The man whose share of the last prize had felt slightly wrong. The officer whose orders had seemed slightly too sharp. The captain whose judgment had perhaps brought them into this windless hell rather than around it. All of these became worth discussing in low voices near the water barrels, and the discussions grew longer as the days without wind accumulated. The psychological erosion of idle days was bad enough on its own, but it did not operate in isolation, because the longer a ship sat motionless in the doldrums, the faster its fresh water supply became the only thing anyone was actually thinking about. This is the part of the story that the adventure versions always abbreviate, because it is unglamorous and slow and deeply unpleasant, but it is the mechanism by which the mental deterioration accelerated from irritability into something considerably harder to come back from. A crew of any meaningful size needed a substantial daily water supply simply to function. A large pirate vessel might carry 150 to 200 men, and each of them required roughly a gallon of fresh water per day to stay healthy in tropical heat, which means the hold needed to contain hundreds of barrels just for drinking, with no margin for the delay of an unexpected calm. The barrels themselves were part of the problem. Wood absorbs and releases, and water stored for weeks in oak casks in equatorial heat became stale, then foul, then genuinely dangerous, growing algae and bacteria that added disease to the dehydration already in progress. Sailors masked the taste with whatever they had available. usually rum mixed into the ration in a blend called grog, but this introduced its own complication. Alcohol accelerates dehydration, so the very substance used to make the water bearable made the shortage worse. When the calm stretched beyond a few days, the rationing began, and the rationing is documented with a specificity that makes the reality very concrete. William Cowley, a buccaneer who recorded his 1685 voyage from Cirebon in Indonesia toward Holland, wrote that the ship was reduced to 1 pint of water per man per day for almost 2 weeks, a ration so small that a man doing physical labour in tropical heat would begin showing symptoms of serious dehydration within days. Captain Macra, writing after his encounter with the pirate Edward England, left his ship crippled and struggling toward India. Through windless seas between the Arabian coast and Malabar, described the same single-pint allocation, and recorded that the crew was, in his words, almost in despair of ever seeing land. Philip Ashton, held prisoner aboard Edward Lowe's pirate vessel, reported that Lowe's crew was so desperate for water, they counted on reaching Tobago to resupply, but the current ran against them, and the season was so calm they could not recover the ground needed to make port. In the first stage, the thirst is simply consuming, crowding out other concerns and making concentration difficult. By the second stage, with the body meaningfully deprived, irritability sharpens into something closer to aggression, judgment degrades, and the capacity for the kind of patient, cooperative reasoning that keeps a crew functioning together begins to fail. Beyond that threshold, with the ration at a pint a day in equatorial sun, the brain itself begins to suffer. Confusion, visual disturbances, and in severe cases, hallucinations. The mind manufacturing what the horizon refused to provide. A coastline, a sail, a source of relief that was not there. Salt water, which surrounded the ship in every direction, was useless and worse than useless. Its 3.5% salt content required the body to expend more water processing it than it delivered, so drinking it accelerated the very crisis it seemed to offer an escape from, and men in the late stages of thirst sometimes drank it anyway. The body and the mind unravelled on the same schedule, which meant that by the time a crew's psychological state was most dangerous, their capacity to make rational decisions about that danger had already been significantly compromised. The hallucinations that dehydration produced were not the only ones the doldrums generated, and this distinction matters because the two types fed each other in ways that made the overall psychological picture considerably more complex than simple physical deprivation. Even men who were still adequately watered, early in a calm before the rationing began, reported visual phenomena on a becalmed ship that had nothing to do with thirst. The flat, unbroken surface of the equatorial ocean under full sun acts as a mirror, and the heat rising from it produces atmospheric distortion that can make distant nothing look like something solid. A coastline, another vessel, a landmass materializing on the horizon and dissolving when approached. These were mirages in the technical sense, optical effects with a physical cause, but a crew already worn thin by idleness and heat had no mechanism for distinguishing them from real sightings, and the emotional cycle of hope followed by its collapse repeated across days was its own form of psychological damage. The most durable legend the becalmed ocean produced, the Flying Dutchman, almost certainly grew from exactly this kind of collective experience, the story of a phantom ship glimpsed in conditions of extreme sailor stress, present at one moment and gone the next, appears in maritime folklore from the 17th century onward, and its persistence across generations and oceans suggests not a single origin, but a recurring phenomenon, groups of men in extreme conditions seeing the same thing, and transmitting the account as supernatural explanation, because supernatural explanation was the only framework available to them. The sighting reported in the log of a vessel carrying the future King George V off Australia described a ship lit with a strange red light. Masts and spars clearly visible to 13 separate witnesses, that vanished completely before anyone could reach it. That this happened to trained naval personnel on a vessel that was not becalmed shows how deeply the legend had shaped the expectation. But the original sightings almost certainly happened on ships sitting motionless in the doldrums, where the mind had been softened by days of idle heat, and the horizon was performing its optical theatre on a daily basis. The documented mutinies that followed periods of becalmment show the same progression almost every time. Magellan's fleet logged those 9 nautical miles across 20 days off Sierra Leone in 1519, with rations cut, and the crew's resentment building toward the open rebellion that eventually came months later at Puerto San Julian in Patagonia, where the Spanish captain seized 3 of his 5 ships before Magellan suppressed the uprising. Walter Raleigh sailed from Plymouth in June 1617 with 14 ships. and a promise to King James that he would deliver 1/2 ton of gold ore in exchange for his freedom after 13 years in the Tower of London. And the Atlantic crossing that followed killed 42 men before the fleet reached South America, with the crew trapped in the doldrums for 40 days, scurvy and fever moving through the holds. Raleigh himself collapsing on deck and surviving, he later wrote, on stewed prunes for more than 20 days because he could not keep solid food down. The expedition fell apart entirely once it reached the Orinoco, not because the gold was not there, but because the men who survived the crossing were not the same men who had left Plymouth. What the doldrums did in both these cases and the dozens of lesser documented ones was not simply to delay a voyage. It ran a sustained stress test on the social fabric of the ship, applying heat and thirst and purposelessness and optical torment simultaneously for as long as the calm held, and then released the crew into whatever came next with their cooperation frayed, their judgment compromised, and their grievances fully articulated and mutually understood. The mutinies that the doldrums produced did not generally erupt the way the dramatic version suggests, with a single charismatic rebel seizing the moment and the crew surging behind him in one explosive act. The reality was slower and considerably more deliberate, and understanding how it actually worked requires understanding the specific social structure of a pirate vessel, because that structure made becalment uniquely dangerous in a way that did not apply to Navy ships in quite the same degree. On a Royal Navy vessel, the captain's authority rested on the threat of physical punishment that was both legal and immediate. A man who grumbled too loudly could be flogged. A man who organised others could be hanged from the yardarm as an example. And the Navy's long institutional history meant that crews understood this calculus clearly. The enforced idleness of a calm was psychologically damaging on a Navy ship too, but the captain had instruments of control that operated independently of the crew's consent, and a certain amount of dissatisfaction could simply be suppressed by force until the wind returned. This was not a comfortable solution, and it produced its own resentments, but it held the structure together through the worst of it. A pirate captain operated on fundamentally different terms. The articles that every crew member signed before a voyage spelled out the democratic architecture of the ship. The captain was elected and could be removed by majority vote. The quartermaster held independent authority over discipline and the distribution of shares, and the rules governing both were agreed upon collectively before the voyage began. This system worked extraordinarily well when the ship was in motion, and the shared enterprise of hunting prizes gave everyone a reason to maintain it. The captain's authority derived from his competence and the crew's confidence in his judgment, and as long as he was demonstrably delivering on that judgment, the democracy functioned smoothly. When the ship sat motionless in the doldrums for a week, then 2 weeks, and the water ration dropped to a pint and the horizon offered nothing, and the captain's competence could not be demonstrated because there was no wind to navigate and no prize to pursue, that authority began to erode in ways that no article could fully protect against. The meetings that preceded mutinies on pirate ships followed a pattern that recurs across the historical record, with enough consistency to suggest it was almost a standard procedure. Small groups of men began holding conversations below decks or at the bow, away from the officers, in the hours when the watch had nothing to watch, and discipline had relaxed into the general stupor of the calm. These conversations were not initially about mutiny. They were about the situation, about the water, about the captain's decision to take this route rather than another, about whether the shares from the last prize had been distributed correctly, about whether the man currently holding the wheel was the right man for the job. Edward Barlow's journal and the accounts gathered by historians like Marcus Rediker in his work on Atlantic piracy describe this gradual crystallization of complaint into conspiracy, the way a group of men with nothing to do and a legitimate grievance and the democratic right to act on it could move from grumbling to organized opposition across the length of a single windless fortnight. What made this possible, beyond the idleness, was the physical intimacy of a becalmed ship. There was nowhere to go, no separation of duties that kept men apart, and the psychological pressure of the calm meant that conversations went deeper and faster than they would have during a working passage. Alliances formed quickly, and the man who had been quietly unpopular with the crew found that the calm had given everyone time to agree on exactly how unpopular he was. Everything discussed so far concerns men who had, in some meaningful sense, chosen the sea. The pirates signed articles. The naval sailors, many of them pressed into service against their will, at least occupied a vessel where they were the primary concern of those responsible for keeping the ship running. The full cost of what the doldrums did requires looking one deck lower, into the holds of the ships that the golden age of piracy was built around, and that the adventure stories have always worked hardest to keep out of frame. The transatlantic slave trade was the economic engine that made the Caribbean ports wealthy enough to be worth raiding, and the ships that carried it ran the same equatorial routes that pirates sailed, through the same windless belt of ocean, carrying human cargo in conditions that were catastrophic under normal sailing, and became something beyond easy description when the wind died. A typical slaving vessel in the late 17th and early 18th centuries packed between 200 and 600 enslaved people into a hold designed for cargo, with clearance between decks of as little as 18 inches in some documented configurations, chained in rows, in heat that was already extreme at sea and became lethal when the ship stopped moving, and the minimal ventilation provided by forward motion disappeared entirely. The crew above deck suffered the doldrums as a psychological and physiological ordeal. The people below decks experienced it as something closer to a sealed chamber filling with heat, disease, and the specific horror of complete helplessness in conditions that were already producing mortality before the calm began. The water rationing that reduced a pirate crew to a pint per man per day was applied differently in the hold, where the calculus was openly commercial. A ship's captain carrying enslaved people to market had a financial incentive to keep them alive, since a dead cargo paid nothing, but that incentive was weighed against the cost of provisions, and when supplies ran short in a prolonged calm, the people generating the profit were the last to have their ration maintained. The mortality figures from Middle Passage voyages that encountered extended becalmant show spikes that the records sometimes attribute to disease, but that align precisely with the periods of extended windlessness in the ship's log. The two running together because dehydration and heat exhaustion weakened immune systems and made the disease that was already endemic in the hold significantly more lethal. Above decks, meanwhile, the Royal Navy was quietly accumulating evidence of what sustained sea service did to the men it relied upon. An asylum in London, established around 1755, was specifically designated for naval men whose minds had broken under the conditions of service. By 1813, when the calculation was formally made, the number was 7 times. Sailors went mad at 7 times the rate of the general population on shore, a figure that the Admiralty's own physicians produced, and that led, eventually, to genuine reforms including improved diet, and some acknowledgement that the mental condition of a crew was a naval resource worth protecting. The author Nick Compton, in his History of Madness at Sea, notes that the Admiralty's concern over the shocking levels of insanity in the 18th century Navy drove some of the earliest systematic thinking about what we would now call occupational mental health, arrived at not through compassion exactly, but through the military logic that a crew that had lost its mind was a crew that could no longer fight. The doldrums sat at the centre of all of this, not as the only cause, but as the crucible where every other pressure, the isolation, the heat, the physical deprivation, the purposelessness, the fear, was concentrated and applied without interruption for as long as the calm held, which could be 40 days, and sometimes longer, and the ship just floated there on the mirror-flat water going absolutely nowhere. What the sea gave these men, when it gave them nothing, was a particular kind of suffering that the age had no proper name for, and that the histories built afterward took considerable care to minimise. The storms and the battles and the scurvy made it into the record because they were dramatic and finite. They arrived and passed and left wounds that could be counted. The calm left a different kind of damage, slower and less visible, the kind that accumulated across days of total stillness, until the men sitting on a motionless deck in equatorial heat were no longer quite the same men who had sailed into it, and the social structure of the ship had been quietly renegotiated in the shade below decks, while the officers pretended not to notice. The golden age of piracy, that roughly 40-year window between 1690 and 1730 when Atlantic piracy became a genuine maritime and political crisis, is usually understood through its violence and its colourful figures, its Bartholomew Roberts and Edward Lowes, and the legal machinery that eventually suppressed them. What that framing underweights is the environment that produced and sustained those men, the specific pressures of a life lived entirely at the mercy of wind and water, where the absence of weather was as dangerous as its excess, and where the mind was always the vessel's most vulnerable component. The Royal Navy understood this eventually, reluctantly, in the institutional language of asylums and physician reports and dietary reforms. The pirates had understood it earlier and more directly, which is why their articles were written the way they were, with protections and shares and democratic checks, by men who had served on ships where the alternative produced the kind of desperation that a 40-day calm could turn into something irreversible. The word they gave us, doldrums, is still in everyday use, still meaning a state of dull, petulant stagnation, still carrying the mental condition that named the geography rather than the other way around. That the language of psychological collapse became a place on a map, and that the place on the map became the language of psychological collapse again, is a strange loop that contains the whole story inside it. The sea taking something from men's minds and the men returning it to the sea as a name, and neither the sea nor the name ever quite letting go. If you want to see what happened when those same crews finally reached land and the violence the doldrums had been building found a target, that video is on screen now. Subscribe for more of the history that got cleaned up before it reached you.